Welcome to ESG in Practice, where we turn environmental, social, and governance topics into practical, actionable steps.
I'm Em, your guide to data-driven sustainability insights.
And I'm Abby, with 2 decades of hands-on experience in this field.
Together with our guests, we're unraveling the complexities of ESG, where we move the discussion away from glossary reporting
to make sustainability and compliance a real competitive advantage for your business.
Hello, everyone. Today here with us, we have Cecilie Wetlesen Borge. Hello, Cecilie. How are you today?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm very excited to have you here. And I would love if you could share a little bit about your diverse background and let our listeners know about yourself.
Thank you for having me. I used to be a compliance officer back in 2010. At that time, not many companies had compliance officer as a specific function. When working as a compliance officer, I worked closely with my colleagues on environmental sustainability and H&S, like health and safety. That was very useful. After then, we've had the GDPR, and now we have ESG. For many years, doing sustainability was about communication and branding, trying to appear to be responsible. And now it's so full of law. It's so legalized. Suddenly, sustainability is so much about compliance. I've also been in the public sector, in the Norwegian Competition Authority. That was before I started as a compliance officer and heading their investigations department. Of course, I experienced when we went out on so-called dawn raids. I was often wondering, where's the compliance program of this company? Because they seem not to know at all what to do when the public authority is there and asking to see their books. That led me into compliance. After having been the compliance officer for some years, I changed my field into consulting. Being a lawyer, but not really working with legal matters as such, but more organizational development. The most important tool of all were really risk management. When I was with Norske Skog, in addition to the compliance officer function, I was the risk manager, and then I became also the company secretary. So at that time, the GRC was the most common acronym, governance, risk, compliance. And in Norske Skog, I had all of those roles.
Cecilie, how is it different from being a consultant, a lawyer, and compliance officer?
Being a compliance officer in an industrial global corporation is very much about understanding how the organization works. It's important in such a role to clearly facilitate, just as clearly make sure that all the way up to the CEO, but every line manager is really the one responsible for compliance. So it's very common in companies that they say, oh, we have someone responsible for compliance. Here is the compliance officer. And I say, no. Compliance officer is not responsible for compliance. Compliance officer is responsible for developing the systems to make sure the company leaders at every level in every part of the organization has a chance to find out, or even better, knows what are the rules, what are the expectations, to have support from the compliance department or the compliance officer. One of the things you do a lot when you're a compliance officer is trainings. You do training. You prepare training, you carry out training, you document training, you follow that training, and then you do it the same over and over again. Although it's interesting to meet all those people and so on the audience side, it's more or less passive learning, right? To be taught something, it's really passive. In order to have a result of all these efforts, I think it's a much better way to actually involve people in the actual risk assessments. Because when you sit around the table and you discuss the risks, that's when you get it. Feel the risk, and you can discuss with colleagues, why does this risk occur? What's the probability? How can we prevent it on a probability level? If we cannot prevent it, what are the consequences that may hit us? It's not one consequence. You need to have a specific risk understanding, and when you have that, it's so much easier to have people motivated to actually follow the rules or to mitigate the risk in their daily operations.
I agree with that, because I've seen that in organizations, risk assessment done and asking employees, like, what do you think the biggest risk is in your company? If you're not exposed to the different risks or understanding of it, about what risk is, you'll just be like, nope, fill in the Excel file, and then you move forward. Use that as a training process instead of this a 10-minute online training, but meeting with people around the organization and doing that risk assessment becomes training in itself. That's a really good point, because I've seen risk assessments just become a paper exercise. Like, are there any risks? No. Move on. And they're not actually really diving deep into understanding what risk could be, because you don't know what you don't know. So you're not going to necessarily add something into the risk register without having that discussion.
I think in order to be successful as a compliance officer, you need to have a clear facilitation mind. You need to develop the systems, including monitoring and reporting. These risk workshops, the people out there working in the sales department, for instance, they will understand the risk of that or the probability of that happening because they know the business. They know that people talk together and suddenly you have organized or coordinated prices with a competitor. They can tell you all about the probability and the situations where that probability occurs, and that makes it easier for you to handle that probability. But they are not necessarily the right people to understand the consequence. The consequences can be huge, yes, but they may not know that, although they know very well the marketplace and the possibility and probability. Involving the right people and setting aside enough time to do proper risk assessments is just so much more effective than training.
Oftentimes, when you're working from the headquarters, whether you're a lawyer or you're a compliance officer, you're maybe not close enough to the business, to the people on the ground that can be telling you. One of my learnings in the career is how to get to understand the business from the ground, to the sales who are on the ground who have to execute on the business. How do you actually meet with them, talk with them, get to know them so that they will tell you certain things that they're worried about? Might not understand the actual implication of what they're worried about, but then you understand as an expert in risk what they're talking about. And I've done that exercise before where it's made me identify risks that I didn't even know existed because they were worried about this. And then I could bring it back to overall, okay, this fits within the mandate that I should be focusing on, but I didn't realize this was a risk because I didn't talk to them. That's a very important part for compliance officers and sustainability officers to really understand the business from the ground.
Yeah, and I think you cannot avoid working through risks. You're not out there to talk with every employee. You need to work through leaders, and that means you need to have leaders who are engaged, interested, and have a basic understanding of the risks connected with cartels, anti-corruption, GDPR, but also other sustainability issues. And that's the double materiality analysis, which is now on everyone's lips, and people are really frustrated about what is it? What is a double materiality analysis? And when they get to understand what it is, they say, oh my God, we can't do all of this. It's too comprehensive for our little company. Yeah, that's today's reality, right? You can't avoid getting into this topic, and you need to work on it with a very holistic approach. Otherwise, you will just be extinguishing fires.
How would you describe the difference between a double materiality and a risk assessment that has been in place before?
It's a good connection you make there because the double materiality analysis is really a very complex risk assessment in a way. Before, when we did risk assessment, we would look at risks and potential. You would look at the positive aspect of a risk as well. That you also do in a double materiality analysis. But the double materiality is really about understanding not only what can hit our business, it's also what impact does our business have on our stakeholders, surroundings, environmental and social matters. It's about understanding our impact on these outer factors. And a common way of describing it in Norway, at least, is the traditional risk perspective is outside in. What can happen to us? What can hit us coming in? And then the impact dimension is to understand our inside, how that affects the outside of us. It's not only our direct impact on our surroundings, it's also the impact that we make indirectly through our supply chain. And with the Norwegian Åpenhetsloven, Transparency Act, supply chain goes all the way down to extraction of resources. The same with CSRD, which is the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directive. Also direct impact of our product when it has left our facility. You need to understand, how does my product affect its users and third parties, and not only the customer buying it, but also when it's not being in use anymore, when it's to be resold and be used at the next level, or even needs to be wasted in some way, can be recycled. Will it cause pollution? What happens to it? That's part of our responsibility as well as a company, because it's an indirect impact. So it's very complex, very comprehensive. We just need to start developing a common understanding of seeing our products, our services in such a wide 360 degrees perspective.
Cecilie and Abby, also, you have been talking a lot about comparison between double materiality and risk assessment, but for some of our listeners, I would like to get to the very basics. What is a risk assessment and why do we do one?
Many companies don't do risk assessments, but they should. They really, really, really should. For me, it's such an effective tool for developing good priorities and having everyone on board on the same factual basis. Risk assessment, traditionally, as I mentioned, is trying to understand what can hit us. It should be done for every every part of an organization. There are many ways of structuring a risk analysis. Main thing is it needs to be structured. If you don't have a structure of your risk assessment that fits your organization, you will just lose track and control.
And how would you do that?
One way of structuring a risk analysis or assessment would be, for instance, saying what processes do we recruit people? That's a recruit process. We buy goods in order to use them for production. Well, that's the supply process or procurement process. Then we have production of services or goods. Those are the production processes. Then we have decision processes. Making a process chart can be one way of starting a risk assessment, saying what could happen in all of these processes. Then you would feel we don't cover all risks, and that's quite right. That's one way of structuring. Then you can structure it and say, for instance, what are our operational risks? Those are risks that originate from our operations, where procurement is one part of it, and production is another part of it, and sale is a third part of operation. Then another kind of risk could be financial risk that is connected with currency fluctuations, financing of the company, like the treasury risks and so on could be financial risks. There are many ways to structure, and the most important thing is that you have a structure that everyone involved is on board. Otherwise, you have very difficult discussions.
Yeah, and I've seen Big Four have these enterprise risk. It comes into this whole sector. You have compliance. You also have another function called enterprise risk if it's separated or oftentimes in one position. Enterprise risk, it's all of the risks that can happen in the company and what are the impacts, and you can't do all of them. So you have to prioritize what are the risks that can have the biggest impact. You start filtering based off of facilitation risks if we bring it back to governance. What is the risk of paying the small amount of money to get your product off the port versus losing 100,000 worth of your product every day it's on the port? And these are the risks that you need to decide within your business. What is the right avenue given this? You're stuck in a hard place no matter what. And how do you plan to try to prevent this risk from happening? But if you don't even talk about it or even consider that this could be on your risk radar, you'll never address it, right? Or never find a long-term solution. So it's narrowing down, I think, all of the risks within the organization. And then how do you prioritize them? And then moving forward with that.
So make the categories that are useful for you. And then as you are understanding very specifically how this can happen to us, because only then you can identify and measure how to reduce that risk. It's useful also to say, let's do a bottom-up risk assessment analysis and then also top-down. Because if you're operating globally, you may have similar risks in different parts of your operation, but not every part of the operation will be hit by the same risk at once. The risk of a fire in a factory, every factory has a risk of fire, but they will not burn down at the same time, all of them. On the other side, significant market disruptions will hit the whole company within a very short time. One example, the Novo Nordisk, which has this slimming medicine, but then they find out it can be used against obesity. I think that's a major disruption for all the other slimming pharmaceuticals in the world. So you need to really understand your risks and then you can handle them.
But it sounds to me like this is a very strategic position, going back to the compliance officer.
Oh, that's such a good point. When I was a compliance officer, I was so frustrated with hearing about colleagues who had this position and they had no mandate and they had no budget. So what can you do? On a sunny day, you're your boss's best friend in a way. When the shit hits the fan, you're everybody's enemy. You're lame duck, you know, there's nothing you can do. Everyone wants you to sit still and keep quiet, right? But it's a very strategic position. And I see now there are so many companies hiring sustainability officers. And I hear about young people who get these jobs and they don't get the mandate and they don't get a budget. And I'm thinking, what is the tone of the top in so many companies? Do they really want something with this position, or are they just realizing we need to get something done, so we'll hire someone, and they don't really understand what they're up for and what that person needs in order to create the value for the company?
Absolutely. I think that's a great point. What does it take to create the value? I say you can tell the tone at the top or the company, how much the company cares about the topic, whether it's sustainability or compliance, based on where the person sits within the organization. If they're sitting a little mid-level, then it might not have the tone at the top. If they're sitting at the higher level, closer to the CEO or closer to the board, then you know it's a strategic role. And we've talked to some companies on our podcast where sustainability is in the executive management team. they have the seat at the table. And there are other roles where, yes, you and I have been in the industry long enough to see that it's a position with no budget, really no mandate, and you're left with training and trying to convince people with the limited resources that you have. And it's a tough position.
In that regard, we can now compare compliance and sustainability. And I also think that understanding the importance of documenting responsibility. If it's not documented, it's not done. You can also ask, do we really need to have such high focus on sustainability? And I think let's play with words a little bit and say, if something is not sustainable, it's really a high risk, isn't it? If you have a situation, a product that's not sustainable, you're doing something in an unsustainable way, you're really running a high risk. The understanding of the importance is just going to grow. People will understand more and more.
So it seems that the position of a sustainability or a compliance officer is quite important given the strategic importance of it. So how come it is not always the top of the company or organization?
Honestly, I think we need to realize compliance is not a very sexy thing. It's perceived as boring, something that we just need to have.
I think there is not a clear understanding of what a compliance officer does or what they can do, or even a sustainability officer. It's more seen as a cost. We have to have it versus what is the competitive advantage of having a compliance or sustainability officer is, especially with the regulations coming in now, but always as before, there is a really great opportunity to harness this role and make it a competitive advantage.
If you have the strategic perspective on that position when establishing it and setting it up in your organization, you will get to that. But many companies don't. Ideally, we wouldn't need to have that position because ideally, management and leaders at every level in every part of the organization, that would be part of their basic understanding, the risks and the opportunities of their role in their job. But it's good to have someone who facilitates it, who keeps an overview. But I think that where we are getting at is an overall change of how organizations are run. We're not seeing that tomorrow because there are so many things that need to be changed. The organizations who manage to do this effectively will work in a very different manner than traditionally has been the case. That doesn't mean there will be, in a way, more work, but to work in a different way.
That's something that I'm very passionate about. Having been a compliance officer, sustainability officer, you're often reactive, you're often pushed, you often have limited budget for everything that you want to do. Doing the same thing that we've done for the last 15, 20 years, this industry, it doesn't work anymore. There's digitalization, there's data analytics, there's oversight that you can do to be able to manage your limited budget and have better oversight. IT, HR, finance have all digitalized, but one of our tech colleagues recently said he was very surprised to see that the way that we work clients, it's still like in 2001 is what he was saying. There's a lot of file folders of information, just training lists of attendance sheets. How do you actually harness that data? We have to learn how to work differently.
If you run your business based on an updated risk understanding and risk in a very wide sense, you use that risk understanding and your updated risk picture as a basis for the leadership's agenda and the board agenda. And look at the Companies Act, right? It puts the responsibility of having oversight on the board. How can you say that you have oversight if you don't even know how the company works to identify and follow up relevant risks? And now that ESG, it's really working itself into the workplace and business life and the whole of society. And you have the concept of, and also very good regulation of a double materiality analysis. If you don't take that data and put it as the starting point of your agenda as the group leadership or corporate leadership and the board, you will just be doing it as a separate exercise and it'll kill you. You'll have nothing out of it and it will create a lot of extra work instead of ingraining it into the processes where you're already working.
Exactly. I think the closer you are to the management or the strategic thinking, the better you're able to integrate it and not have it be a side project that you're doing on your own.
Yeah, but the thing is the leadership, it needs to be there as expertise as well.
Yeah, you can't do a very good risk assessment or strategy building without the leadership actively involved.
But why do you think it is that this industry hasn't been very much digitalized or data-driven? Does it have something to do with the quality of the data?
Resources, possibly. Also attention, whether it's perceived to be a strategic role or not. Now that we're starting reporting according to CSRD and the larger corporations, it will expand to cover smaller companies. It's so difficult for companies today to gather these data, but it won't take many years until the data is there. Today is a burdensome time to be a small company because you need to do so many things that you didn't need to do 5 years ago. But in a few years' time, when the data is there and digitization has come further, we will see so many interesting opportunities develop, because now we can't even imagine what this vast amount of data, when they are there and systematized, it will really open up so many opportunities, so much understanding.
I see that too, because we're working with some larger companies and the data is there actually from compliance or governance. They didn't know how to harness. They're just collecting the information, whether it's a whistleblowing information or around third parties. They're collecting it, but they weren't able to analyze it or have oversight. I think based on the knowledge and based on the priority and based on the technology at the time. And then for smaller companies, I do see moving forward as it becomes clear what you should collect and what all companies collect. Small companies might make it easier because they haven't probably started anything. So then if they actually know what they need to start collecting, then it'll be a lot easier than maybe a larger company that has already 15, 20 years of history of compliance data that they're trying to figure out how to make it fit within a certain criteria.
The reporting of data will make data available far outside of the organization. Yeah. And it'll be easy. Many business models are really built on the accessibility of big data that was not there before. Yeah. And they're only there and they're only available because there is a reporting obligation. Data and the ability to systematize huge amount of data will create so many business opportunities, really. I think so too.
We've talked a lot about companies that have resources and they have the ability to hire a compliance or sustainability officer. What is your recommendation for companies that don't have such resources and are confused where to start?
That's a very relevant dilemma for many companies. For brand new companies, you won't even surface today. You won't have a chance unless you have a product or a service that provides some kind of a positive impact. Of course, you need to understand your market and how your product or your service will meet your client's need, because if you're someone's supplier, you will be part of their supply chain and they're going to report. And then, of course, you need to be careful not to greenwash, because if you greenwash, your clients will be in a way greenwashing too. And that's the legal aspect. Reporting needs to be truthful. Being a good founder, manager, and leader today requires that you're able to see the strategic importance of doing your operations in a sustainable manner and document that. First and foremost, we need profits. There is no way around profits. But if that's what you care about, you're in sort of a loser's game, because you need to care about so much more today.
Yeah. And I think for smaller companies, it's like one understanding that even as a small company, like Cecilia said, you need to think about this strategically. But how do you do it without any resources? That's always going to be a challenge when you're a smaller company. What can you do in terms of getting a group of really passionate people who care about sustainability together and talking about trying to create, I would say, a light risk assessment or light double materiality? There's a lot of resources on the net how to do this, and not to try to follow every direction from A1.2 to A1.12 to Z1.3. How do you highlight it 2 or 3 material topics and start from there? From that, understand what do you need to do to mitigate it? What do you do to manage it? What policies should you have around that to start to grow from that? As your risk assessment and your understanding of the business grows, then you might realize, okay, it's time for a resource that you need, or it's time for technology, or time for something to change. But I would say start with an active group of passionate people that want to work on this topic. I think that's a great way to start harnessing it. And also leadership at the top. I wanted to talk to you about the role of leadership and top management and the board, including the CEO and the board. How should they be managing sustainability or clients? We've talked a little bit about the leadership, but I would also want to emphasize the board.
Being on the board is a serious thing, right? And I think it gets more and more serious. The attention on the board's role and board members' responsibility is increasing. For small companies, gather a group of people who are knowledgeable about sustainability and so on. I think we cannot forget, and this is an old phrase and everyone now says it doesn't apply anymore, but I think it applies. The business of business is business. That used to be a very capitalist perspective on things. It's not like that anymore, but I think it is. The business of business is business, but business today is so much more than just a profit and money.
True.
That's why I think that a lot of idealistic people who want to make the world a better place and have laid their eyes on sustainability as a prerequisite for a better world, and it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. in leadership roles, including boards, we need to include people who have a sufficient understanding of governance, not sustainability, because their role is setting out a company, making sure that it has the proper strategy and plans and budgets and steering documents in place, following up on how the company is developing and understanding its risks in order to address them. And I know that many boards are wondering how to even ask the leadership the proper questions so that they can get the relevant information. That's the dilemma when you're on a board, that you're really dependent on the information that is provided to you, and you can request more, but you need to have a person in the room who is actually able to ask the right question.
Oftentimes in a leadership role, the next role is to be on a board. You want to have the board member on your CV, but I don't think a lot of people really understand the consequences of being a board member. There is possibilities of individual liability. You are responsible for the governance of the company. And I don't think that's taken seriously. They don't necessarily realize the impact of their role.
It's important to understand that you're responsible for the governance of the company, but not for every detailed decision. The only possibility you have of carrying out that role is to really understand the systems of the company and how it works, and make sure, of course, the systems are implemented and monitored and that deviations are registered and improvements are made and all of that. But understanding this whole circle of a governance system.
And that's why I think a risk management process or enterprise risk is very helpful for a board. Is the company understanding the risks of doing business, and what are they doing to mitigate it? If listeners are saying, well, if I'm on a board, what questions should I be asking? I think that's one, is like, do you have a risk register? What are the top 3 risks that you're managing it? And then when they show you, do you agree based on your knowledge of the industry and the product and what is selling? Do you have any thoughts on other questions that board members should ask?
If you're on a board and you don't know what questions you should ask, you shouldn't be on that board. No, but in order to protect people, because I'm just waiting for law cases where one company has marketed or even in an offer described its products and services as sustainable. You're part of a supply chain and you don't really know where it ends up, what's the top level of your supply chain, and you don't know the financial arrangement of that top level company where your product is part of the supply chain. You branded it as sustainable and they have a green loan or a green insurance something, and then someone finds out that their supply chain, and that's you pointing at you saying that's not sustainable at all, and you have lawsuit coming. These are global matters now. Without proper understanding around the board table, it doesn't mean that everyone needs to have the same expertise, but you need to have that expertise on the board so that you're able as a board to govern the business at the level of responsibility that the company has decided to have.
Sometimes board members aren't aware, and I think that's where a good opportunity for a compliance officer or a risk officer or a sustainability officer to have access to the board to share what is going on in the company and what are their challenges and what are their risks. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes compliance officers or sustainability officers don't have access to the board. But if you're actually meant to be an independent role, they should have access. And I think that would be a tip to a board member. If you haven't sustainability officer in a year, then you might want to ask them and invite them to present, because I can guarantee you the sustainability and compliance officer would love the opportunity to present to the board. If they're not presenting, it's probably because management doesn't want them to. And that's a red flag in itself for governance.
That's absolutely true. As a board member, you're really dependent on the CEO and having the right tone at the top.
All right, now we are at the exciting part. Are you ready for the rapid fire questions, Cecilie?
Absolutely.
Okay, one word to describe the future of ESG.
Inherent. You need to do it inherent.
Biggest misconception about ESG?
Oh, that's easy. That's avoidable.
Your go-to metric for ESG success?
That would be the number of risks that you've covered, and not that the number in itself is important, but the maturity of your risk understanding and the materiality understanding, the maturity of that.
Biggest challenge in ESG implementation?
Yeah, that's the idea that implementation is separate, parallel exercise. It needs to be inherent.
And in your opinion, what is the most underrated aspect of ESG?
It's all of the opportunities that it entails. We haven't started seeing the opportunity side really yet.
ESG in one sentence?
It's here to stay.
And why is ESG implementation more important than ESG reporting?
First of all, you won't have anything to report if you haven't previously set a goal and implemented measures to reach that goal. If I simplify a bit, if you have a change or a development without previously communicated goal and a plan to reach that goal, you have merely a change. You don't have a reportable improvement. So you need to see that logic and the dynamic that everything starts with a plan, and the plan should be relevant in order to meet your challenges and reach your goals. It's a risk-based plan.
Cool.
We've asked you a lot of questions now. Do you have any questions for us?
I guess I have many. I'm really curious learning more about Fortify. I hope I'll be able to follow you because I think there are so many service providers and digital product providers out there who are trying to capture part of this market. But I know that you have a subject matter expertise to actually create a program and a product that should be creating real value to companies. That was not really a question, but maybe a question that I hope I'll be able to follow you.
Yes, so we could share more about that later, but I appreciate that. I appreciate having you on the podcast. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, it's definitely been a delight. And although it's not the first time we met, it feels like I learned a lot more about you today. A very impressive career. I'm hoping we can stay in touch.
I hope so too. And thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all our listeners for your support so far. If you like this episode, we will highly appreciate you rating it 5 stars to help increase the reach of ESG in practice.
And if you want to be notified when our next episode drops, please hit the follow button.